If you've ever tried to read the Bible from the beginning and you managed to get through some of those genealogies in Genesis, chances are you got bogged down in Leviticus. Now, the name Leviticus comes from Levi, one of the sons of Jacob, who is also known as Israel. This tribe was designated by God to provide the priests for Israel. The early Jewish rabbis called this book the Priest's Manual. It is almost entirely devoted to worship, offerings, sacrifices, ordination of priests, rituals for cleansing the unclean, how to celebrate feast days, etc. More than one Christian has asked, what does Leviticus have to do with us? As children of the New Covenant, are we bound by the worship laws of the Old Covenant? I would say no, we are not. But it's not so easy to draw lines between worship laws and moral laws. As children of the New Covenant, are we free from all of these laws? How do we decide what is binding for us and what is not? That's another good question that you may want to think about. Not all of Leviticus is worship-related. Leviticus 25 talks about a Sabbath for the land once every 7 years, and a year of Jubilee every 50th year. Interestingly, the wanderers in the wilderness had no land at all, not yet. During the Sabbath year, the fields were to be left fallow. During the year of Jubilee, once every 50 years, all the lands were to return to their original tribal ownership. There was supposed to be a systematic leveling within society. These laws tried to impress upon the people that God was the ultimate owner of everything, and that whatever existed was meant for the sustenance and survival of all. The phrase that Jesus uses in his first public sermon in Luke 4:16, the year of the Lord's favor, that phrase is related to the Jubilee language found here in Leviticus. Again, we face the question, what authority do the laws in Leviticus in particular, and in the Old Testament in general, have over those of us who call ourselves Christians? Could it be that because of Christ, our relationship to all of the Bible's laws is now different? Hold on to that question until Lesson 11. It's easy to see why the next book is called Numbers. Chapters 1 through 4 are basically a census of the people camped in the wilderness. Chapter 26 is another long list of names and numbers. Scholars have argued about how to understand the numbers recorded here. In chapter 1, verse 46, it says the grand total of people brought out of Egypt was 603,550 people. But if the word that is translated as thousand actually means tribal group, as some scholars suggest, then the population comes to 5,550. Now, does it matter to us? I personally wonder at the logistics of moving over 500,000 people around the desert for 40 years. The smaller number seems more realistic to me. But we need to remember that the purpose of this story and of the entire Bible story is not to get us fixated on logistics and scientific possibilities. Remember, the Bible is a book written out of faith for faith. God is a God of order. God saves God's people in hard times. God does not give up on us. The book of Numbers trumpets those themes again and again. In chapter 13 and 14, we hear the story of how God brought the people to the edge of Canaan, the land promised long ago to Abraham, which today is modern-day Israel and Palestine. 12 spies were sent in to check things out. They came back and said, we have good news and bad news. The good news is that it is a rich land, flowing with milk and honey. The bad news is that it is already full of people, and they look like giants to us. Joshua and Caleb, 2 of the spies, pushed for an immediate invasion, saying, God will be with us. The other 10 cried, impossible! Why did God bring us out here to die? The chosen people lost their trust in God right there on the border. God got fed up with their waffling and decreed that the whole gang would have to wander in the wilderness for one whole generation until all the voting adults were dead. Poor Moses. He thought his job was almost done, but now he had to lead the people and put up with their complaining for 40 more years. The final book for our lesson is Deuteronomy. The name comes from 2 Greek words, deuteron, which means second, and nomos, which means law. The book of Deuteronomy is presented as a review and a pep talk by Moses to the people of God as they are about to enter again into the Holy Land. In the 40 years since the covenant at Mount Sinai, Moses has been leading the people, coping with their struggles, helping them learn how to trust God, worshiping with them, and praying for them. The people have been learning how to be a holy nation. Now, just like a coach before a big game, Moses goes over the game plan one last time before the kickoff. In the first 4 chapters, he reminds them of everything God has done for them. Here's what he says in chapter 4, beginning at verse 32. For ask now about former ages, long before your own. Ever since the day that God created human beings on the earth, ask from one end of heaven to the other, has anything so great as this ever happened? Or has it ever been heard of? Has any people ever heard the voice of God speaking out of a fire as you have heard and lived? Or has any God ever attempted to go and take a nation for himself from the midst of another nation, by trials, by signs and wonders, by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and by terrifying displays of power, as the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your very eyes? To you it was shown, so that you would acknowledge that the Lord is God. There is no other besides him. From heaven he made you hear his voice to discipline you. On earth he showed you his great fire while you heard his words coming out of the fire. And because he loved your ancestors, he chose their descendants after them. He brought you out of Egypt with his own presence by his great power, driving out before you nations greater and mightier than yourselves to bring you in, giving you their land for a possession, as it is still today. Then Moses reminds them of how God wants them to live. In Deuteronomy 5, we find the 10 Commandments once again. And finally, Moses reminds them how living in a settled land will be very different from living in the wilderness. It will be a life full of a new set of temptations. Read Deuteronomy 8. Ask yourself if it could be applied to any people that you know. Satisfied and satiated people are tempted to trust more in themselves than they are in God. Than they trust in God. That was true then, and it is true now. Moses finishes his sermon, blesses the people, transfers leadership to Joshua, then climbs to the top of Mount Nebo. From there, God allows him to see the promised land, but Moses will not set foot upon it. His mission is completed and he dies. He is held in the highest esteem among the chosen people. 1,200 years later, when Jesus is born, the name and the memory of Moses is still very much alive. We've spent a lot of time on these first 5 books of the Bible because they are so important for the rest of the story. These books are traditionally called the 5 books of Moses, though nowhere in them is he mentioned as an author. Another name you might hear is the Greek term Pentateuch, which means a work divided into 5 scrolls. The Jewish community calls these books the Torah. Literally, Torah means law. But as we've seen, these books have a lot more than laws in them. For the Jewish people, Torah means something more like teaching. And these 5 books teach God's people who they are, where they came from, and how they are to live. Our next lesson will follow this adventure of God's efforts to forge a new people. A people meant to be a blessing for the entire world. A people meant to help bring this world back into harmony with God's intentions. Here are some questions you might think about. What might it mean to have one's heart hardened by God? How do you think we should relate to the laws in the Old Testament? What signs of God's sustaining hand have you seen in your life? And then finally, here are some sites for those of you who want to dig in more. Thank you for listening. And God bless.